Welcome to the podcast. My name is Father Bill W. I'm an Episcopal priest, and I live here in Austin, Texas, and have had the gift of recovery since December the 27th of 1972. The purpose behind these podcasts is to try to go deeper into the spirituality, the history, and the psychology underlying the 12-step path to recovery. I'm particularly interested in a thing called two-way prayer. That was a form of prayer and meditation done in the early days of AA. Came out of the Oxford group, and I just kind of stumbled onto that about 31 years ago, totally turned my life around. And as a good, faithful addict, I've been trying to milk it for all it's worth. So that's what my life is much about, is trying to get two-way prayer out to people in 12 steps. So go to the website, it's titled Two-Way Prayer. We got a video there that you can read. I'm working on a book, hope to have that ready by maybe who knows? When the now clock runs around to then, that's when it'll be ready. Sometime next year, let's hope. Hey? And when you're there at the website, make sure you sign up for our newsletters. So should have a new one coming out in January. So this is the fourth and final episode in a series we're doing, and the series is titled Recovery Gems. And Gems is also the name of a book written by my guest, Andy C. from Victoria, Canada. There is a link to the book and a way for contacting Andy that I have put in the show notes. And Andy is an attorney. He's in long-term recovery from alcohol addiction, sober since 1977, and active in 12-step recovery ever since. And if you listen to Andy's and my first episode, both he and I are working really hard to be old-timers in the program rather than long-timers. So trying to keep what the Buddhists refer to as beginner's mind. Keep the program fresh. And I think if you approach it in the right way, you're going to find that the growth potential is endless. If you approach it the wrong way, you're probably going to run into a wall before too long. So want to keep it exciting, engaging, and that's what I think Andy's trying to do as well. So welcome back, Andy. Good to have you here again.
Good to be back, Bill. And I think, you and I are both working hard to engender and enhance spiritual growth. You didn't mention it, but I know that the website and books that I produced, or we produced here on our end, are posted on the links to this podcast.
And we've been taking a deep dive into Gems, which is a kind of what would you call it? Sort of your own musings, meditations, reflections.
I refer to it as meetings in a book. They're the kind of things that you'd hear at shares at meetings. 3 books now: Gems, More Gems, and Still More Gems. So,
and that's part of your service work. Would you look at it that way?
Absolutely. I use the phrase, it's our goal at our end is to engender and enhance spiritual growth. So that's what my book productions, I've got other materials on the website that are available. So yeah.
And you're not looking to make any money at this thing. It goes to help a treatment center you helped get going?
Yeah. So everything is plowed back into recovery.
Okay.
There's nothing in it for me except the sheer pleasure and joy. And, I referred to engendering and enhancing spiritual growth. I'm sure, like your journey, this work engenders, enhances my own growth.
That's important. It can't be all going out. It has to be some stuff coming back in. This episode, we're going to take a deep dive into the world of inventory, okay? And it's kind of a specialty, I think, for you. You're very big on the benefits of it and the process of it, and have used it extensively in your own recovery. So you open this section of the book on inventory saying, removal of defects clears the path to spiritual growth, but a defect must be identified and named before it can be removed. What are you trying to get at there?
Yeah, in my experience, a generalized request to have my higher power, my God, remove my defects has not proved to be effective. They just,
Wash me whiter than
yeah,
snow.
please, right away. And so, but one day I noticed that the seventh step prayer reads differently from the seventh step. Seventh step says, remove all my defects of character. The seventh step prayer refers to each individual, every single defect of character. And I thought, well, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Before I can have the character defect removed, then it has to be a singularity. I have to, and then I thought, well, I have to name it. And that insight led to my journey in inventories and defect removal, that it is important to identify and name the defect. Now, before I came to the program and started 12-step life, I knew there was sort of a general problem with drinking, but I had to identify it. I have a problem with alcohol. I have a singular problem. I could name it. I have alcoholism. Once I could name it, then God and I could begin working on it.
And by name it, you also mean get to know it, huh?
The naming in some, at least at some level, is the knowing,
Yeah.
isn't it? You know,
Yeah.
once you can name it, you actually know it,
Right.
and you can see it better. Yeah. So it was an initial insight, a threshold insight that led me on my journey. As I say, the generalized removal just didn't work, but specific removal, that works very well.
You make a remark that I had to think about for a minute, but I really found it very important. You say step 4 is only the beginning of the process, and that leads to step 5. But then in step 5, that has two parts: confession and conversation. I don't
Yeah.
know that I've ever really reflected on the conversation part, but it's really important. Huh? It gets overlooked.
And again, drawing on my experience,
Yeah.
it's something that I saw in my own story. You know, we admit to ourselves, our God, and another human being the exact nature of the wrongs. So I've had conversations with myself. I once had an argument with myself, and it got so bad I threw myself out of the room. Um, but that's I have a difficult time having conversations with myself. And conversations with God, I get the two-way prayer. I practice it assiduously ever since I heard about you and your insights. But it's not the same as a conversation with a human. And I realized that when I talked to my spiritual coach, my fifth step taker, that there was two things going on. The first was confession, and that released the pressure from the secrets, from the harms, the stuff that I didn't want to admit.
Right.
All the pressure was gone, and all the barriers created by that pressure were gone. But there was another thing going on because we were talking. It was back and forth. He'd say, well, what about this? And how did you frame this? And then in later years, we began to identify the exact nature of the wrong. He'd say, well, what do you think was going on here? What's the root cause? Where was the power in this coming from? And that all emerges from a dialogue, a conversation with my spiritual coach. So I began to see the fifth step as not just a confession, but a conversation. And now when I do fifth steps, it is a conversation. I hear it, that's fine. I hear the fifth step, but now we're going to talk about it. And in the talking back and forth, we refine and clarify our thoughts and our insights on what's going on.
In the early days, there was perhaps more of a focus on sharing with one another.
Mm,
And in the conversation, the fellow I did it with, he owned some of his stuff as I shared my shame and guilt. He
yeah.
shared some of his that he had dealt with. I'm new at this thing. And without taking the focus off of me. You got to be real careful of that when you're hearing a fifth step. It's not, don't make it all about you, but there's a leveling that goes on in conversation, not a from on high down to below.
In fifth step work, it is very powerful to start with myself and an admission. You know, like much like we start with our own drinking when we're working with a newcomer. When I'm working with somebody who's giving me their fifth step or I'm taking their fifth step,
Mm-hmm.
I show them how it works. And at an early stage in the conversation, I indicate to them, I'm open, and here's how I see and frame some of my defects of character and or some of the stories of my defects of character. And then they're invited to participate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it makes it
Yeah,
safer.
it does. It does.
At the end of my fifth step, a fella I did it with said something I've just never forgotten. You know, his final remark was, "Bill, welcome to the human
Yeah.
race."
Yeah. It's one of the secrets of the fifth step, isn't it? Bill mentions it in passing, but it breaks down the walls of isolation. I don't know how it does it. It makes no sense to me. I can't connect the dots, but I know it to be a fact. That what you said, what your fifth stepper said to you, it is magical.
It was true.
Mm. It is. It is
It was
very true.
true. I've used that line 100 times in doing fifth steps ever since. You get a good one, you may as well use it, you know.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, they don't it doesn't wear out.
No,
Yeah.
and they're not copyrighted in anything, so
And
it's
they're not copyrighted.
it's all
Yeah.
right. Uh, one of the things you're dealing with in the fourth step, and then maybe even bigger time in the fifth step, is dealing with all the guilt and the shame. I don't know how you feel about this, but I was taught there's a difference between guilt and shame, and guilt is that I've done something wrong, and that's accurate. I have done things that are wrong, and
Mhm.
it's good to feel guilt for that.
Mhm.
But there's also shame, and that's deeper. That's not that I've done wrong. It's that at a very deep level, I am wrong. A lot of sorting out of that has to happen in 4 and 5.
I agree that. I agree that, which is why I think some people don't like to get into an inventory because it exposes that.
Right.
You and I are both students of the 12-step program, and we both know Ernie Kurtz, who
Mm-hmm.
wrote some brilliant stuff. And one of his efforts was a book on shame and guilt, one that I use with my fellows, and who are having trouble with approaching the fourth or fifth step. I say, well, okay, you're talking about guilt and shame. And Ernie points out, he uses a football game metaphor, American football. And he says, guilt is like a penalty. Yeah, you were offside. That's guilty. You're guilty of
Mm-hmm.
being
Yeah.
offside. Shame is just not making the first down. You fell short of the mark. In both cases, you can pick yourself up, you can take the penalty, or you get another down, or the game goes on. It's not a first order tragedy that's going to kill you. So both perspectives are very useful
So
because
you're referencing a stuckness, if I'm hearing you right. Is that
well,
right? I'm
I'm
stuck in it.
yeah,
I
I'm
won't let
right.
go of it.
That's right. And when in fact, no, you can pick yourself up and the game will go on.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we'll talk about this maybe later, but the instructions in the fourth step are fearless, not fearful. It
Right.
doesn't say do a fearful inventory. It says do fearless. And I tell my guys, don't be afraid. Well, I also tell them, listen, you're going to spend how many hours writing about yourself? Well, so far you have been your favorite topic of conversation. So you're going to really enjoy this fourth step process.
Mm.
Then you get to talk about yourself. The fifth step's going to be even better.
Well, this is where prayer is so important throughout all of the steps. Even
Mm,
in approaching step 4, to approach
hmm
it prayerfully, because
hmm
that really helps to lift the fear and to approach it honestly.
Right.
Follow me?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for me, the moment of prayer, and my shortest prayer is God's in this, which is my most frequent prayer. And as soon as I say that, I change my focus from myself and my fears and my little obsessions. I change it and I just think, okay, something greater than myself. In my case, it's my higher power. And that shift in focus allows me then to get on with the inventory process.
Yeah, and that shift is everything. I mean, it ain't a little deal. It's a huge one. It really
Yeah,
goes
it's
to the
funny.
depths of who I am and what I'm about and what this moment is for. It's
Yeah,
huge.
it's one of these little program insights that's both nothing and huge, nothing and
Yeah,
something at the same time. I mean, you just change your focus, and
right.
wow, it breaks free.
It's
Yeah,
like the God is everything or he's nothing, you
yeah,
know?
yeah, 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 yeah.
You know, you like to kind of say, well, I'm kind of in the middle, you know. No, you're not.
Mm,
It's
hmm.
everything or nothing. And the
Yeah,
more of everything we can get to, freer we become.
yeah.
That's my experience.
This
Uh,
program's it's full of these little, God
yeah,
is everything or nothing. It's also true that God is everything and nothing. So,
I can go. Yeah, I do better with people who are at either end of those extremes, you know,
mm,
than the wishy-washy in the middle, you know.
yeah,
So give me a good atheist. I'll have a
yeah,
lovely conversation with them. The exact nature of our wrongs. You got a couple of gems that talk about getting down to that level, the
yeah,
exact nature of the wrong. Can you try to walk us through that and what that
yeah.
feels and sounds like?
I don't think in the rooms we talk enough in the fifth step about, we talk a lot about the confession and how difficult it is, but
Mm,
what we're after is the exact nature of the wrongs. I heard a share years ago that really hit the mark. He said, we're after the exact nature, not the exact details.
mm, good.
And in early fourth steps, we get a lot of the details of the wrongs. And,
Yeah,
and that's
they
important.
put me to sleep when I'm
Well,
doing a
they
fifth
can.
step. When I'm doing a fifth step with someone,
Yeah.
if they're dragging me through that, but when they get to the nature, then that
Yeah.
strikes my nature.
Well, and the fifth stepper can guide the conversation towards the nature
Right.
and, and get to the stuff that underlies the stories.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. And I use it wasn't my problem. I didn't have a problem with shoplifting, but it's a powerful metaphor or analog that I use to describe this. It's in the gems that you're dealing with somebody on their fourth step, and they've got 300 episodes of shoplifting, lots of shoplifting. Sometimes
Right.
they're caught, sometimes they get away.
Hmm.
That comes out in the fourth step. The exact nature that you can identify at that time is you're a kleptomaniac. Got it. Okay, that's the deepest you can go. Then a few years later, because I do steps every or an inventory every year, the stuff comes up again, and I say to my sponsor, well, "Why is this stuff coming up again? I dealt with it years ago. I made apologies. I paid back the money. Why is this stuff arising? Well, we're not sure. Let's just go through it." We discover in that year's fifth step, the confessional conversation, not only was he a kleptomaniac, but as he was reaching for the product on the counter or on the store shelf, as he was reaching for it, he recalls he had a deep and profound sense of entitlement. I'm entitled to take this.
Hmm.
And then we had another, deeper than the kleptomania, was underlying a sense of entitlement in his shoplifting. And sure enough, we found that throughout his life, he had this sense of entitlement.
Right.
And then a few years later, the same episodes come up again. By now, we know that there's something deeper. So in the fifth step that year, we discover that not only did he had a compulsion to steal, and not only was that compulsion underlaid by a sense of entitlement, the sense of entitlement came from a sense of pride and a rewriting of the rules of ownership that was so radical that as he was taking it, not only was he entitled, he was saying to himself, this is mine. It just happens to be on the wrong shelf. He was rewriting the reality of the world. It was not his, it was someone else's. He was assuming almost a god, maybe not god-like, but a demigod, a little small god. So with each layer, each inventory and fifth step process, uncovering a deeper layer of the nature of the defect. This has certainly been my story. My story was not shoplifting. My story involved anger, temper, and I found that same sense of entitlement and that same sense of pride that required me to judge. Yeah. So
Is
this
there not, if you dig even beyond that, my experience is I get to a fear.
the fear comes in my observation of my story. The fear comes from the denial of the entitlement and the denial of my judgment and the denial of my creation of reality. And the reason it strikes so deep and so fast, it goes right to my heart. It's not just, oh, this
Right.
isn't working out the way I thought it was. This is not working out the way I declared it should be.
Your worldview gets first shattered, let's say, through the
Mm.
insight, and then able to put the world together again in a more humble and human fashion.
Yeah, to
Yeah.
accept the world, to
And
accept
to
the world.
accept
Yeah,
yourself
yeah,
and your
yeah.
place in the world.
Hmm. It's a process of integration, isn't it?
I think so. I
Yeah.
think so. Yeah, it's almost, I mean, this ego thing. It's fascinated me ever since I got into recovery. It's like, my
Hmm.
God, this thing is huge,
Hmm.
you know, and distorted.
Hmm.
And so it takes a lifetime, I think, of really peeling away at it and seeing its manifestations. That's why I think inventory is so extremely important.
And we've got it in the 12-step, but others have written about it. Alfred North Whitehead is a prominent American philosopher, and in his book, The Aims of Education, he talks about how we learn. And the first step is enthusiasm. Now that it's excitement, but it could be fear, but there's a lot of feeling around the learning subject. And then there's complexification. We get into the details of the subject. And the third and final phase is synthesis.
Mm-hmm.
So we get that. We get the newcomers who are afraid of the fourth step, and they finally get into it, and then they, can get rolling with it. But then there's it's complex. It's all of the stories and the manifestations and yada yada yada. But then the final step, which the fifth stepper, a good fifth stepper, in my view, will take them through, which is what we're talking about: synthesis or integration,
Mm-hmm.
the completeness of the whole. Yeah,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I ain't all light. I've got darkness, and I need to get to know my darkness. Really leads us into this next point that I wanted to cover in one of the gems. Okay, and it's you title it the habits of meditation.
Mm.
And when I first read it, going over that whole chapter, I said, well, this thing seems out of place here. That should be back in with step 11 and all that. But when I read it, it made a hell of a lot of sense, linking it to inventory. And what you're saying there is by taking inventories, frequent inventories,
Mm.
I get to know my character defects. And then its place in meditation, in the daily meditation, it has an important role there. So talk about that. Tell us how that works for you.
My journey started in inventories with a sentence in the big book, which said, Bill says, businesses that don't take regular inventories usually go broke.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at my life and I thought, well, that makes sense. That makes a lot of sense. And I was a lawyer in business and invested in a lot of businesses, and inventories were critical. So I thought, habituation, habit of inventory is just a good thing. And businesses do them on an annual basis. So you referred to daily. Well, my inventory cycle actually starts with an annual inventory. On my AA birthday, I do another one every year. And then I do quarterly, monthly, weekly, and dailies. Now that sounds like a lot of work. And it is, but it doesn't seem like work. All of the inventory work I do, the dailies take minutes. The weeks take maybe a few minutes. The months take maybe, no, it's rarely that I would take more than an hour. The annual takes some days. It does take work, but it's habituated and it gets easier with time, doesn't it? If we do them frequently and habituate them, it gets easier all the time. And we see the patterns. If you don't repeat it, I don't see the patterns. But when I repeat it, then I see the patterns, which sounds like a tautology, and in some senses it is. I can't do one inventory and see a pattern. That doesn't work usually. I have to do the repeated inventories. And boy, let's use the dailies. This has showed up every day for the last 14 days. Okay, you got something to work with then. But similarly, weekly, monthly, quarterly, this has showed up every week, or this has showed up every quarter. Yeah, yeah.
But if I get to know my defects of character,
Mm,
Jung might say, as I get to know my shadow,
hmm
it becomes, I get to engage with it. So what I took away from that reading was in my morning meditation, I've got something coming up that day. I'm going to meet with
Yeah.
so and so really pisses me off. All right? Because
Mm.
I know how I respond to so and so. And that by knowing myself, by knowing my shadow, by knowing my defect, I don't try to push it down. I'm aware of it. I bring it into consciousness,
Mhm.
but then I pray about it. How am I going to approach that individual or that situation or whatever it is that's coming up? I'm going to meet my probation officer, and there's a huge fear that's there. Well, I need to take that inventory, and by taking the inventory of what's that about, it helps me prepare for that meeting in a different manner. Am I reading that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. No, and reviewing the day. How did that meeting go?
Well, right, right.
You know,
Not so good.
yeah, I lost my temper. Well, okay,
Right.
that didn't work out so well. Or thank God I thought about it early in the morning, because you know what? The meeting went well.
That's where 10 on a daily basis flows into 11.
Yeah, your movement into 10 is interesting. I considered, and I have considered, and I've got some thoughts on the difference between a moral inventory and a personal inventory. If you read the steps, if you said, okay, 4 you do once only, okay, that's a moral inventory. But then 10 is a continuous, or I
Yes.
could use the word habitual,
Right.
personal inventory. So
Right.
well, I wonder what, Bill actually uses moral and personal kind of interchangeably, but there may be something more here than just two words, different words for the same thing. And my story includes a shift from moral to personal. And as I mentioned, every year I do an inventory, and I use the 4 column method, or 3+1 column method, outlined in the big book for my annual inventories. And one year I went back and reread the instructions for the fourth step, the 4 column inventory. And I read it carefully. In the sentence that begins, it says, we started with a grudge list,
Mm-hmm.
which was not a list of people we had harmed.
Right.
It was a list of people with whom we were angry.
Right.
And I thought, well, I'd never focused on that. I'd never seen that language before. And I thought, well, wait a minute here. This year, then I'm going to focus on who makes me angry. Now, that included a lot of people that I'd harmed. There was still the harms and damages, but there was a subtle shift to including people who were irritating, who made me, put me off, made me angry. Maybe I had not done any harms to them, but they made me angry, and that enlarged the scope of my inventory. So the shift from moral to personal. Moral is harms and damages.
Right.
Personal became much more. It included harms and damages, but it included relationships that were off.
Right.
And
That's right.
as the years evolved, my annual and other inventories included that larger set of people, principles, and institutions.
I'm a big fan of Star Wars, you know, and a great believer in the Force. And
Mm,
I kind of use step 10 in that manner. Is there a disturbance in the Force? You know?
yep, yep,
And by that, I mean in my connection, my relationship with other people, for whatever reason, like you're saying, for whatever reason, it might not have
yep,
hurt them at all, but there's a disturbance in the force. I'm not feeling compassion towards them. I'm feeling anger or fear or jealousy or
yep, yep.
whatever it might be.
Well, if I can just digress for a moment, what this allowed me to do, this expansion allowed me to do, and this approach allowed me to do, is suddenly to consider principles. Because
Okay.
in my first inventories, I kind of glossed over principles. How do you harm a principle?
Right.
But if you reframe it and say, are your relationships right? Suddenly I could say, is my relationship with this principle right? And principles are the operating rules of the world. They're principles that govern us all. They're reality. And when I discovered this, I realized, wait a minute, my relationship with many, many principles is not right because I'm insisting that the world and reality bend to my will and my wishes rather than accepting it. So
Right.
this expansion from moral to personal inventories allowed me a more thorough investigation of my relationship with principles and also institutions.
Yeah, I was hoping you would touch on that because that's mentioned in there, and that kind of sounds like coming out of left field at first,
Yeah,
huh?
yeah. You
Where
know,
have you gone with that one?
in Canada, for example, we have our CRA. In the States, you call it IRS. They're both the same. They take a lot of our money. And I never harmed CRA. I never harmed your IRS. I paid but boy, they made me angry.
Yeah,
Boy, they just, so that relationship was off. And I had to come to
right,
terms and say, wait a minute, taxes are a part of reality. If I
right.
don't like them, then I got to move. So, yeah, it was important.
Yeah, and religions and religious institutions
Yeah.
often, for many people, play into that role
Hmm.
as well. That
Yeah.
they need to look at that, you
Because they
know?
didn't, you know, like so many, I listened to Fifth Steps from Catholics. Well,
Right,
they never harmed the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was beyond harming, but their relationship with the Catholic Church, that was off. There was
right.
anger and fear and all manner of issues that had to be resolved.
Yeah, yeah. So that institution, it's worthy of some examination. Let's go to the four columns. You started talking about that.
Mm-hmm.
Let's walk somebody through this process, and particularly reference to maybe a newcomer who's just kind of facing that fourth step for the first time. The big book could have done a better job, I think, of laying it out specifically. I mean, I spent time outlining it exactly when I was trying to approach it, and people give you their versions of it, but what's behind the three column, four column approach? Give it to us as simply as you can.
Yeah, for me, column one, without thinking about things, I just write the names, adjust the names, the people who occur to me. It's kind of a brain dump. And
Mm-hmm.
I do it 10, 15 minutes a day. And I just think about names and I add the list and it just keeps growing and growing and growing. These are the names of people who are irritating me, making me angry. And then sooner or later, I find I run out of names. I just
Right,
run out. And then I turn to column two and say, okay, why are the names there? What are the facts that led me to think about that name? And sometimes that part of the column's blank. I can't think of why they were there. So it's blank, and I may get back to it later. But I worked my way down through column two. And then when I hit the bottom, and I maybe added some names, but I hit the bottom of column two. Then I turn to column three. And I say, okay, how did that make me feel? And again, it's just I let my mind open, and it's just a brain dump, a free flowing of words that come to me as I consider the facts of the situation. And then I get to the bottom of column 3. By now, some patterns are starting to emerge in how I felt and how these things affected me. And then I hit column 4. What was my role? And again, I look at all, look at the name, the facts, and how did it affect me? And I think, okay, what was my part? And by the time, in my experience with the 4th column, within the first 12 entries, patterns are starting to emerge.
Mm.
And the same words are coming up, the same phrases are coming up. And now I'm starting to identify what's going on, the exact where the power's coming from in these manifestations of the defects.
A lot of mine went back to building a wall around myself.
Mm,
It
hmm
took me back to childhood. That the
Yeah,
stuff that I'm dealing with here in this 4th and 5th step, it's been there for years,
yeah, yeah.
you know? And
And
that, to me, that
there's
was the
some,
pattern that I started to see.
yeah. My story is slightly different. But having said that, when I read Russell Brand's book and his inventory process, he actually suggests that you take epochs in your life, like
Yeah.
years 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 10,
Hmm.
20 to 30, and so on. And that can force a fellow that I'm working with back to his childhood. If I sense that there's issues there, I'll often recommend that. For me, the brain dump, the free flow of names coming up seems to work for me because the relationships that God wants me to deal with seem to bubble up.
Yeah.
Yeah, being open to the process is important, which means you have to deal with the fear. If you're in fear, then the process is going to be impeded. But that fear comes back to habituation.
But that's
First
that's
part,
that's another inventory, isn't it? So you do the resentment thing, but I did like that in the big book it focuses specifically on fear, and then
mhm.
specifically on sex.
Well, yeah, yeah. In the big book, I've identified a number of ways within the big book to conduct an inventory, and my sponsor showed me. And actually, if he didn't mean it, I have taken him to mean using sex as a proxy. Because he describes a process which is intriguing. He said, "Imagine the ideal relationship and write it down. Imagine the ideal relationship with uh, a business partner." With CRA or IRS, imagine the ideal relationship and compare that ideal to what's going on. That's a powerful inventory mechanism. And it applies in sex. It's great in sex, but it works in other areas of my life as well.
Well, one of the things for me, a good 5th step accomplishes is really digging into the shame
Mm,
and feeling that, allowing that to come up. I'm not probably as big on understanding it as on sharing it, on allowing it to come through.
mhm.
You know, people can analyze the hell out of it. Give me a good crying session that somebody has gotten to the pain and the shame that they have covered up for years of who they are, how they feel about themselves, at the
Yeah,
very deepest levels. Um, to me, that's cathartic. That's healing. I tend to shy away somewhat from the analytical approach of understanding it. You know, uh, you
mm,
know, all the aspects of it. Experience it,
yeah,
experience the pain. And when two men or two women get together in a 5th step and do that, power is released in their lives. The electricity is running,
Yeah.
and God is present, you know?
Yeah, I I agree all that. If that happens, it's good because it, from my perspective, clears the decks. You use the word cathartic or catharsis, and there's that emotional upwelling that now frees the mind and the heart and the soul to investigate the exact nature. And if I see that cathartic emotive outburst, the next thing I look for is aha. It's not a technical understanding. It's that that's why I do this. Aha, I see what the power is. I see what the root cause of this is. I often use with my guys that in fifth steps, I use the analog or metaphor of a string of Christmas lights, which is appropriate. We're taping this around Christmas time in 2023. And if you think of a row of Christmas lights, each one of the lights on the string of lights is turned on. It's bright. Each one of those is one story in your fourth step. It's a manifestation of the defects of character. And you survey the lights. Well, you can spend a lot of time covering the lights or unscrewing them or dealing with the individual lights. That's the early fourth step. Now, in subsequent and really in the fifth step, what I'm after is the wire connecting the lights. And then after we discover and uncover the nature of the wire connecting the lights, looking at the plug in the wall that's giving the power to the wire that powers the lights. And ideally, in my experience, what we're after is unplugging the wire. That's it's getting to the exact nature and then removing the defect is removing the plug from the wall. And that, in my experience, can take some time and a lot of work.
I think I approach it differently. Lack
Yeah,
of
no,
power is our
no.
dilemma. I better see if I'm plugged into the right wall, you know,
Well,
and to a source of power that is different from the one I've been accessing, which is ego. You
that's
follow me?
interesting. I'd never thought of that, but I think you're onto something. So we unplug. You have to unplug the old one and then plug it into the right power. Now
Perfect.
the light, yeah. See, you got a different light. Yeah, I
Right.
like that. I
I'm
like
with you.
that.
Yeah.
I'm you've improved. I love it. And I'm going
Well,
to
I
start.
see. Now, when you hit 50 years sober, and you're getting there, all of this is going to become perfectly clear for you, Andy. It's just freaking amazing how it
Yeah,
happens.
yeah, yeah. It 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 back to our long timer versus old timer. It's
Yeah. We want
amazing
to get there.
if you keep on thinking about it and keep working it.
Yeah. There's another section of the book that we didn't have time to get to because I wanted to focus very specifically on the inventory because I think that's really important. But the last chapter is kind of an assortment of things. But there's one that's focused on unconditional love. I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but I will never forget. I was at a meeting, early recovery, first year, and people were looking at what really lays behind my alcoholism or my addiction, and people came up with all sorts of stuff, and a woman said, I suffer from a love disorder.
Mhm. Yeah,
And I'm sitting there and it was like boom, a light went on. A
yeah.
love disorder. Love
Mhm.
wasn't coming in and love wasn't going out, you
Mhm.
know and that's what I was stuck in. And
Yeah,
the alcohol, the food, the sex, whatever the addiction might be,
yeah.
plays a huge role in being a substitute for that. So, what do you think about that? Unconditional love.
Yeah. It's start with love and then move to unconditional love.
Yeah.
I tell the story on myself. I've been sober for a few years, and I have an uncle, my uncle Bill. He's passed away now, Bill Crooks. Um, he sold all he came back from World War II. He was terrible drunk,
Hmm.
sobered up, and gave his life to recovery. And at first, he did prodigious 12-step work in my hometown of Thunder Bay, just prodigious. And then he sold everything, sold all of his home, his everything, and registered for training in Hazelden. This is back in the 60s or 50s,
Hmm.
and took a course in recovery counseling at Hazelden in Minnesota. Came back to Thunder Bay, worked as a treatment counselor, and then was recruited to open a hospital in Omaha, Nebraska, or rather a treatment center in Omaha, Nebraska. And I had some business dealings. The client had, oddly enough, based in Calgary at that time, he had some business dealings in Omaha. I thought,
Do you
this is
recall the
great.
name of the Omaha one? Do you recall the name by chance?
The treatment center, it
Yeah.
was in, it was in the big Presbyterian hospital there.
Omaha,
Uh,
oh, back in the 60s and 70s, Omaha had a really good reputation for
yeah.
in the treatment world, halfway houses. I sent a
And
hell of a lot of people to Omaha.
yeah, well, he was the flywheel for that. Uh,
Nice.
I've talked to people from Omaha since then. I've, say, oh, you're from NA, you're from Omaha. Have you ever heard of Bill? And they've heard of Bill Crooks. There's people who are 12 step. I live here in Victoria, and when I was attending a conference one day, and this speaker was a guy. He's now passed away again, Neil Berger, who founded two treatment centers here on the island on Victoria Island, a legend in recovery, again, industrial recovery and individual recovery, working with companies and their recovery programs. And I was listening to his talk, and he said he sobered up in Omaha. And I turned to my wife who was with me, and I said, geez, I wonder if he knew Bill Crooks. And the next sentence in his talk was, and then I met the man who saved my life, Bill Crooks.
Hmm.
And so I went up to him after the talk and I said, my name's Andy Crooks. And he said, you're Andy Crooks. Oh, Bill used to talk about you. But I flew to, back to the story. I flew to Omaha and had supper, saw Bill, saw a lot of Bill. And one night I asked him, I said, with all your years in recovery and working in the program and on and on and on, what's the center of gravity? What's the axle for the program, our life in recovery? And he thought for a bit and he said, the center of gravity, the power in the program is love.
Hmm.
And I remember thinking, I was 5 years sober. Never trust anybody with 5 years sobriety. And I remember thinking, oh, what a cheesy answer. Like I'm a
Mhm.
child of the 60s. I know all about love, but now with the length of time I've got in the program and over the years, I now see the criticality of what he said. The power of the program is, in fact, in my experience, love. And it's a multi-dimensional solution. We learn to love others. We learn to be loved. We learn proper love of ourselves. And all of that, as it matures, becomes unconditional. The more time I spend thinking about it, practicing it, the fewer conditions are attached to it. And just it's maybe the power of the universe. So
Yes.
when somebody says, as you referenced, a love disorder, then my life at a very central level or central point is out of order.
Right. That's
And
right.
and I it sounds funny, but I often say to newcomers, especially guys, I'll give them a hug and I'll look at them and say, it's important that you understand you are loved. And it never ceases to evoke a reaction.
Hmm.
And it's something that it's a word that touches us deeply. Yeah, so I have a love disorder. I love it. It's a great frame of reference.
Yeah. Yeah. And to me, that's what I mean by the force is that force of love present,
Yeah,
or is there a disturbance in the force?
yeah,
You
yeah.
know?
It's a power that must be used with great care, but it must be used.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, This has been fun, Andy. I want to thank you for coming on the podcast and sharing some of this good stuff with us. It's
Well,
been really
I,
swell,
I
as we
I have
say.
to break I have to break in and just say how much fun it has been working with you on this. And it started our relationship started with the great work that you're doing. And I hope the listeners have taken something useful, and I hope that both of us continue to strive and think about these issues and share them with others.
Wonderful, wonderful. And as you mentioned, this podcast should be going up around Christmas and New Year's. And I know that's a tough time for some people, particularly in early recovery. It may be a time of stress. And so I encourage you guys to stay safe, to stay
Mm.
connected, to take your inventory, to do it lovingly, you know, and to be good to
Yeah.
yourself and to those you love. So, Andy, thanks so much. Really appreciate it. And thank you guys for listening. Hope you benefited and are getting your pencils and paper out and taking those inventories. Get to work.
Yeah.
God bless. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. See you next time.